Let's talk about open rates. Specifically, open rates in the context of email engagement, which is the E in our Deliver framework for increasing deliverability. Now, open rates is something that email marketers love. This is probably the metric that's most talked about, the metric that's most publicized, and sort of pervades email marketing in general. I'm not saying it's not an important metric, but of course it's not the end-all be-all metric, and there's inherent biases within open rates, especially in the current time. So in this video, we'll talk a bit more in depth about open rates, how they're tracked, how you can improve open rates, how to look at the biases within open rates and have that in mind when you're evaluating it, and also how that could potentially impact positively or negatively your email deliverability via email engagement. But first off, let's talk about what an open rate is. So an open rate merely means the ratio of the people who open your emails when you send a set of emails versus the total number of emails that you send. Now, that's a simplified definition. Of course, you can get a bit more nuance within there and look at unique open rates, look at open rates where it's opens versus sent versus open versus delivered in the sense that you take out the hard bounces. Or you can look at total open rates. So there's some variance within there, but in general, the concept is how many people open your emails versus how many people you send the emails to. To open an email, that merely means the recipient gets the email in the inbox or in the spam box or wherever they find it actually, and then they click on the email to actually open and look at the contents of the email. So that's a basic definition. From there, let's understand how opens are actually tracked. So the most universal way of tracking open rates is actually putting a one-by-one invisible image pixel within the emails. So you don't usually do that yourself. Most of the time, if you're using a third-party email sending platform, they will automatically add in that pixel for you. So when you send it out and people load the images, then it will track a hit to that email address that they opened it. And each time they go back and trigger it again, they will track another hit on it. As you can imagine, this is not really foolproof. So if people open your emails but actually don't load the images because they have image blocking enabled or something along those lines, then you're not actually going to be able to track that open. Unless they subsequently click through a link, and then that will, of course, mean they opened the email if they clicked it. But also, nowadays with Apple privacy, there's another piece of bias in there because with Apple privacy in iOS, Mail, and such, Apple actually preloads in the background all the emails, including the images, which means you're actually going to have overinflated reporting for Apple iOS Mail users. So, whereas before, perhaps industry averages, at least in e-commerce, for example, were like 25% open rates. Now it's you want to add maybe 15 to 20% additional to that. So now we're looking at averages of say 40 to 50% as an average open rate because of the bias from Apple privacy, which, as you can see, is a big swing in terms of the absolute values. With open rates, then, what you want to do, of course, is you still, even with the biases, you still want to ramp up the ratio of your open rates. So if you can get to 75%, 80%, 90% even consistently, that's going to send a very positive signal to the inbox providers that you are a good sender and you're sending content that people actually want rather than being a spammer potentially and sending content that nobody wants, nobody reads. And when you do that, you're able to increase your sender reputation with the inbox provider and thus have a much better probability of increasing your email deliverability and getting most of your messages into the inbox each time you send, which is, of course, highly important. So what are some ways to actually increase open rates? Well, I like to break it down by three main ways, and it's considering the what, the when, and the who. If we look at that, what are you actually sending? Okay. When we're looking at what you're sending, the most important piece of it is your subject line, and secondarily, your content. So email marketers would love to talk about subject lines and think, that's the end all be all. If you have a great subject line, you're going to have high open rates, there's a lot of truth in that. Like if you have a great subject line, it's something that hooks, then you will probably get higher open rates versus a weak subject line. So it's very important that you actually A/B test your subject lines, really think through what motivates your subscribers to open and really hone in on that. At the same time, you want to make sure the content actually is interesting and matching the subject line. You don't want to bait and switch your subscribers because maybe they'll open that first email, but then they have a negative aftertaste there, and the next email you send, they're like, oh, I got bait and switched once, I'm not going to open. Or if the content doesn't meet expectations, otherwise, they also start learning that, hey, your content, you might have great subject lines, but your content is pretty weak and not relevant, and thus your over time open rate will degrade. So when I talk about what and optimizing open rates, you really got to think about the subject line as well as the content that you're presenting to the specific set of subscribers you're sending your emails to. Another way to increase open rates is to look at your frequency or your win of sending. So when we're looking at frequency, as well as send times actually, that all goes under the same bucket. We first look at how often you're sending your email campaigns. Now, depending on your brand, depending on your audience, you could potentially send very often or not that often at all. So for certain subgroups or certain industries, for example, apparel is a big one, or fitness or education even. Like a lot of times they can send a bunch of emails as long as the content is pretty good. They can send maybe even once per day as a baseline frequency, and they'll still have high open rates and high engagement. Whereas in some other industries, maybe let's say you're a B2B industry and you sell a need-based product that has a very long sales cycle and very long replacement cycle, you can't send it 30 per day or 30 per month. You have to send that maybe once or twice per month, and that's your frequency limit. And if you go past that, you start seeing dramatic drops on open rates. So frequency is something to really consider based on your industry, based on your audience, based on your product, and of course, based on your content to modulate your open rates and keep it high. Another thing to consider around this win concept is when do you actually send your email campaigns? Do you send it on Saturdays? Do you send it on Mondays? And then what time of day do you send it? Do you send it in the mornings, the evenings, the afternoons, in the middle of the night? And also the time zones. So for example, you can localize the time zones and say, hey, I only want to send at 11 a.m. for people's time zones. So rather than I want to send 11 a.m. Eastern, which could mean different time zone for Pacific and for Central and for, let's say, overseas in European time zone or Asian time zone, you could localize and say, hey, I just want them to get it at 11 a.m. their local time, and that could increase your open rates because now they're not getting emails in the middle of the night if they don't fall in your main zone. So the third way to increase open rates is think about who you're sending to. So this comes down to segmentation. Now, I always like to say that, hey, I can get you 100% open rates. That's very easy. I send it to one person, and that's myself, and that'll open your email for you, right? So open rates to a degree it can be very easily biased by who you send it to. So we want to lean into that bias and think about how and when do I send to the most likely to engage segments, right? So if you have a VIP customer segment and you're sending exclusive sale only to VIPs, right? Sending to that VIP segment is going to get you really, really high open rates versus if you send it to people who were leads who never bought and who have been on a list for 3 years and never opened an email, right? That open rates will be dramatically different and dramatically lower. So thinking about who you send to is also a very good factor in utilizing to increase your open rates. Now that we've talked about a couple of ways to increase your open rates, let's summarize by thinking about the impact of open rates. So open rates, even though they're biased, even though they can be manipulated, they're still a good initial indicator of high engagement for both you as a email sender, that you can see that your subscribers are responding well, but also, more importantly perhaps, for the receiving inboxes to see that you always continually have a high open rate and a high ratio of opens to sends, and therefore grade you higher in terms of that sender reputation, and thus for all your subsequent emails to continually give you high deliverability and thus let all your emails through into the inbox, which is ultimately one thing that we really, really want with deliverability and utilizing that E of the Deliver framework.